In 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. Here today to share her journey, current COVID-19 and small business efforts, and more about her recent film, A Fine Line, is Miss Joanna James. Joanna, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
So before we get into the movie, A Fine Line, talking about head chefs, female head chefs of fascinating, amazing restaurants, before we get hungry, let's just go back a little bit more about what life was like before you were a filmmaker and film producer.
Well, you're asking me to really go back because this has been such a labor of love. I hardly remember life before it. It's been about 5 years now that we started making this film. Getting it out there. We created an impact campaign, the MAP Impact campaign, which we'll talk about. So that's been so much over the course of the past 5 years. And not to mention, I had 3 babies while doing this in the past 5 years. So life before this is almost like hard to fathom. But really, I was always just trying to make my mark in storytelling and sharing people's stories. I started as a news reporter, specifically newspaper. I wrote for various newspapers. I interned at the Boston Globe, and then wrote for Greek American Weekly. I'm Greek American, so I joined this newspaper team and got to go to Greece during 2004 for the Olympics, which was amazing. So it was a lot of newspaper reporting, and then unfortunately the industry was going bankrupt. It was hard to get hired for sort of mid-level news reporting because so many newspapers were just unfortunately not sticking around. So that's when I decided it was time to go back to school or try to figure out what was my next move. And I went for international communication and media for my master's, but I would sit in on film classes because I always loved film. And that's how I just started to think more about it. Still not ever really consider I'd ever make a movie. That was never, ever in my mind. But then fast forward and I moved to New York City. And I was hustling. I was trying to get a job any way when it came to either producing, just trying to break into new media as opposed to writing, which is, my love, but I just wasn't finding any traction there. And it was hard. I think I was older than what like an entry-level person would be to break into the market. I already had years of experience, but not necessarily the experience that people would want to bring someone in for producing, and I didn't know anyone. So that's when I decided, why not just try my own, making my own movie, and again, it wasn't even necessarily making a movie. It was really sharing my mother's story, because that's what A Fine Line is all about, and we could talk about that. But I knew that in order for me to do justice to her story, she had to be the one to tell it. I couldn't write about it. I had, people had to hear directly from her because of just, her personality and who she is and what she went through. And that's when I figured out, it was more about the importance of the medium to share it. And, and we figured making a movie.
Interesting. Well, thanks for sharing. And now you say the medium has changed, but you're still storytelling. What exactly makes a good story to you?
Well, it's interesting because I took a class a while back. I had just had my first baby, and I finally needed some time for myself. And the one thing I did was I took this class at NYU, just like, I don't know, one of those continuing ed classes or something. And it was on the Odyssey and reading Homer. Mm-hmm. And one of the profound lessons that stood out to me was because Homer, of course, is like the greatest storyteller ever. And from the beginning of time that we looked to him for advice on this. And he always started his stories in the middle, and then would go back and sort of say, okay, who this person is, and they were born here, and this is their trajectory. But let's start the story. So to really capture the audience, not right at the beginning and go A, B, C, D, E, but, at a point that was really exciting or interesting and would give you another look at what we're about to learn more about. And I think that has really informed my storytelling in the sense that you want to really think about what is it you're trying to tell, what is the most important thing about this subject, this person, and then figure out the best way to start and then go from there and craft the story, around all of that.
Mm.
Um, and it's what's propelling the next action, and especially with editing, because I also co-edited the film. And I loved editing because it reminds me of newspaper reporting, where you really have to whittle away at all the distractions or even things that seem important, but really is just sort of adding another layer or burden to what's at the heart of the story. So it's important to just not have something that sounds good, a really good soundbite, but really what is propelling you to the next part? What's important to keep carrying through?
I really enjoy your perspective on that. And you threw in a couple nuggets there, it's not just a soundbite. And then before with your answer about, this new media, what's been lost in storytelling with the new age of digitization?
Yeah, I think that's very true that there are things I think that have been lost. Number one, people's attention spans because of new media and social media, of course, is so, it's almost like that of a gnat. So to really try to provide a long form piece that is mindful, that is thoughtful, that, like I think of Richard Linklater, who, has his beautiful 3-hour films, before sunset, during sun, those, I don't know if today the audience is going to sit through. But then again, we just had The Irishman, which was, what was that, like 3 hours and 45 minutes or something. But I think in general, what we see happening is people want such fast, quick, news or just to get right to it, that they're not willing to go through the journey of the development, character development, of plot, of theme. So it's not right at your face up front, because it is about the journey. I think to really learn about something, you have to learn all the nuances along the way to then all of a sudden get that epiphany. If a filmmaker or news reporter or storyteller just gives it to you right up front, it's like, oh, okay, but it won't necessarily resonate with you and change your world. Whereas if you get this magical storytelling, by the end of that experience, you feel like, wow, I've just learned so much, and it's made such an impact on me and my life, not just, those couple hours of watching whatever I watched.
Character development, like a transformation almost. That
Yes,
you as
exactly.
a reader or someone who is watching this film.
Right.
Definitely. Now, Joanna, let's talk about the fine line now. You said that you mentioned there was a story about what your mother used to say, or a metaphor that your mother used to have. Maybe elaborate and expand on that just a little bit more.
Sure. So basically how this started was I was talking to some friends about my mother. We had met up and we hadn't seen each other for a while. And they were shocked to hear of some of the different struggles that she went through as a businesswoman, as a mother, as a woman. And I found it surprising that it just stuck, struck a chord with them. So that's how this all started, where I wanted to share my mother's story, because she's a 30-year restaurateur. She faced a lot of challenges along the way. It was also a time where I think as women, we were trying to figure out, and we still are, but especially a few years back, all these conversations were so important and on the forefront. How to do work-life balance. If you're, thinking of family planning and having kids, how do you do that when you're also trying to get a promotion in your career? So all these things, and yet my mother went through most of them. So that's how I started to think, okay, I want to make a movie on my mom. And it became a documentary. But as I was researching and filming my mom, I realized that so much of what she went through was really happening again today, in terms of, again, the conversations in the culinary industry, where world-renowned chefs and restaurateurs were talking about these things, or, they all shared a universal story. And so we decided to open it up and include their perspective, and sort of, my mother's story is the central narrative of this film. And then a lot of what she went through, some of these different very timely issues, we hear from these chefs like Dominique Crenn, who's the first and only 3 Michelin star female chef in the US. Lydia Bastianich, Barbara Lynch, Kat Cora, Maria Loy, so Elizabeth Faulkner, there's many. And so that's what the film is. It explores why less than 7% of head chefs and restaurant owners are women. And we do that through very a personal story to really get at the heart of what the reason is.
And have you found that these chefs have similar backgrounds to you? Did they also have mothers that, grew up in the kitchen making those homemade recipes all the time?
Some, yes. Thinking about in this film in particular, the different subjects, many no. Definitely many of the greatest chefs that we consider today, most of them do say, or many of them do say, that they were inspired by their grandmother or mother who were in the kitchen. So for sure. And that's why it's always shocking when people hear the statistic. But, it's funny, like Barbara Lynch, how she started was a home ec teacher, in her high school, who just gave her first chance in life because Barbara was sort of an unruly student and wasn't into school and was sort of, getting into trouble. But it was her way to be herself. She found a salvation in cooking. Lydia Bastianich, she went to Italy, back to her roots, and really connected with a lot of different chefs there and would apprentice and learn. But yes, for her specifically, it's a beautiful story because she left after, during World War II. She couldn't go back. And so she left her grandmother, who was just such an important figure in her life, like her own mother. And so cooking for her was a way to stay connected to the traditions, to her, homeland, to her grandmother, who she wouldn't see for many years. So there's a lot of those beautiful stories too.
Now, the example that came to my mind when I was thinking about this was, I can be a great basketball player. I can be a great recipe, I can be a great chef, but it doesn't mean I'm going to be a great coach. Doesn't mean I'm going to be a great leader of an organization. To you, what makes a good head chef? And maybe expand on the bottleneck that females face with becoming head chefs.
Yeah, well, to be a chef, and especially a head chef, is a lot of pressure, stress, and work, because you're doing so much. You're not just doing the craftsmanship of creating a plate, and that creativity and all of that is involved, which in itself is quite a lot. But you're also having to keep your team excited about what they're doing and uplift them so they grow. You're also having to keep the margins in order so that you can, keep the restaurant going. And that's what's so difficult about restaurants, is that they have such tight margins. You have to keep everything floating the right way, like labor costs, food costs, inventory, all of that. But then, of course, you want to try to stay true to what you're doing. So yeah, a head chef has a lot of responsibilities. They have to figure it all out. And I think for women, it was hard to come into their own for this position because they weren't believed in. It was like no one, and I'm talking about 20, 30 years ago, when a lot of the women who are featured in my film were trying to get ahead. And even today, it's still very hard because obviously the numbers prove that. But it was even much harder for them, where they weren't taken seriously and no one thought they could do it, that they could handle it. And a lot of the reasons why are just false narratives, like long hours, physically grueling, when really it was just convenient for the people who were in power to elbow out any woman from coming in. So.
What do they say when they're going through this process? I mean, I saw some testimonials on your trailer about, their first experience when coming in. They're looking at me to literally have sex with me. They're looking at me to, put me down and make all these snarky comments. What's it like for in an introductory, chef that's a female in today's day and age?
Well, I think today is a lot different. I really do. I still think, of course, it's out there, and you have to be, ever vigilant on your values and how you conduct yourself. But number one, the kitchen itself has professionalized more today. So it doesn't matter whether you're a woman or a man, the standards have gotten much more better, which is great. There's less hazing, there's less of this bro-like environment
Mm.
that literally so many of the chefs had horror stories of, like, one was that a, a line cook got a piece of salmon and slapped it across a woman's face. One was that anytime she would go into the walk-in cooler, the cooks would turn off the lights on her and then try to come in there and tease her. I mean, it was like really just harassment, other than hazing and just, not the type of behavior you would expect in a work-like setting. But a lot of that has changed, which is great. Because no one wants to work in that type of environment, including men. So that's good. Number two, you also see that a lot more women are going into leadership. So they're also changing the standards, where it is becoming more authentic to the way they want to run their own business. And we see that this is sort of spreading. Because for a while there, women said, at least some of the women that I spoke with, they had to put on an armor and they had to sort of change the way that they would normally act to be accepted and be able to advance in their career.
Mm.
Whereas today you hear that's not the case necessarily, that women are willing to be more authentic to who they really are and what they think is right. And the more women we have leading these kitchens or their own restaurants, the more we see a whole new way of leadership.
That's good news. That's good news. Now, what about like the production, Joanna? Like, how long did you spend time with these head chefs? What's the timeline on a production film like this?
Well, number one, even just this documentary, it was, I would say, sort of unorthodox the way we went about making it, because it was my first film. I didn't have any budget. It was like I just was so committed to making it, and just knew after I did that first interview with my mom and just saw, like, wow, I was even impressed at how raw she was, at how much she opened up and was just so honest. And it was very unarming. It was really great to just see how cathartic it was for her, but how much profound knowledge she was sharing with people. So I just knew we have to go with this. We have to get it done. And so it was a lot of back and forth. I would film, get some really great footage, make teasers to then raise more money, go back into the community and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. This is what we've got so far. What do you think? And there was a lot of women who would come, behind me to say, let's do this. We'll host a party. We've got the food, we've got the wine, we'll show a short piece and then raise money so that you can keep finishing the film, or different organizations that, donated some money too. So it was very unique in that regard. But that's how I was able to make the film. And then basically for production, because I was operating on such a, shoestring budget, unfortunately I couldn't be with these chefs for weeks or, every documentary is different, but I had to really be very precise on what I was looking to get from them. So I would go and film them either in their kitchens or, whatever they were doing, whatever to show their actions, but then also sit down interviews. Sometimes it would be a few days. Sometimes I'd go back and reshoot, maybe sometime after I went through all their footage and realized, we need a little more or whatever. So, but production was pretty much in, I would say one full year, and then went back and did some more shooting after that, after editing and realizing, I can still go back and get some more.
Did the narrative ever change? I mean, you mentioned you were there. "Oh, I need to go get some more. I need to dive a little bit deeper. Did the narrative ever change from the original raw interview with your mother? And how have these head chefs impacted you?
Um, the narrative, interestingly enough, didn't really change that much. Yes, the film itself changed a lot, all these different rough cuts. And I made a rookie mistake at the beginning where I showed my mom the film thinking, oh, we're so further along. This is great. And it was, now looking back, it was like, no way. But I was like, oh, here we are. And my mom, being as straightforward and candid as she is, was like, this is horrible. What are you doing? So, which is great because it made me go back to the drawing board and
Nice.
realize what I had to do. But, always that story I had in my mind, I think really did stay true from the beginning to the end. It was just a matter of how we got there. Just because it was a matter of interweaving the chef's stories as well, and that we wouldn't have too much of one story and not enough of the other, and that it would seamlessly come into my mother's story. That was like this central trajectory. So that was the tricky part, just sort of navigating those things. But the story always pretty much stayed true. Then the Me Too movement happened. Because that was, early 2018 in terms of directly related to the culinary industry with Mario Batali and Ken Friedman. And I knew we had to address it. By that point, I had already started the film festival circuit. So the film, for all intents and purposes, was finished. But it just didn't sit right with me to not address this. And especially because some of the chefs were directly associated with them. Like April Bloomfield was Ken Friedman's partner, former business partner. So I went back out and did some filming at that point. We heard from Angela Rayner, who is a chef and co-owner of the boarding house and Pearl in Nantucket. And she went through experiences that were very traumatic. And she didn't realize what an impact it made on her life until really reflecting back, 30 odd years later and realizing, wow, it really did like completely change her trajectory. So that was very powerful to add that into the film. And it was an expensive decision to make. We had to unlock a finished picture. And, when you re-edit something into what is a finished film, that's not easy by any means. But it really made such a big difference. And then we, released the film thereafter that.
It's early March, and COVID-19 causes the United States to go into a self-quarantine. And small businesses are struggling. Less people are going inside. It's just a bad time in general for any small business owner at this moment. What's going through your head, and what are some of your peers telling you about how this is impacting their business?
Oh my God. I mean, it was so unsettling and scary because you knew right away that the restaurant industry and hospitality industry as a whole was going to be forever changed. You knew that. I mean, and I knew that because I was raised in this industry by my mother's side, and I was already seeing what she was dealing with. We had just finished our release, in which we had a New York City premiere, theatrical premiere. We went to DC and had a screening on Capitol Hill in partnership with the National Partnership for Women and Families, because our impact campaign, the MAP Impact Campaign, is about empowering women to lead through mentorship and advocacy. So we had already been advocating for years, about a couple of years, for the need for a national paid leave policy. The US is the only industrialized country in the world that does not offer paid family leave. And so that, for us, is a big issue on how to get more women in leadership across all industries, not just the culinary industry. But COVID-19 really brought these issues to the forefront. All of a sudden, it's a time of reckoning because you can't hide away from these things anymore. Like the fact that many of the U.S.'s employees, of their workers, don't have paid leave. So if they're sick, they have to either go to work sick and risk spreading it to someone else, or they can't afford to take the time off because it's not covered. So these are the types of issues that we realize it took a global pandemic to finally start having these conversations. But what we also realized right away was, wow, we really need to do something to make sure these small businesses are protected. Because when you think back to 2008 and you had the financial meltdown, that in large part was caused by some of these financial institutions, the housing crisis, mortgage crisis. They all got a bailout. And here we are facing a global health pandemic that no one foresaw coming, or imagined would be like this. And these small businesses we know are not going to survive. Already 4 in 10 restaurants have closed down indefinitely. And the likelihood is pretty dire of how many of these restaurants will be closed. I mean, some figures are like 75%. I mean, it's really scary. So we went right into advocacy mode and started trying to do whatever we could to galvanize the industry, to unite. Because the thing with the chefs and restaurateurs is they're so busy and they're so focused on their work that it's hard for them to get out of their comfort zone to consider doing things like this, which is, organizing. But that's what was needed for, making sure that they would get federal and state aid and really, the help that was needed to even just survive these months, let alone the long term. So we created a letter that we put on our website. We engaged directly with many of these chefs and restaurateurs, asked them to sign the letter, and then it would go directly to each legislator, both on a state and federal level. We had already had some of these platforms developed because of our national paid leave policy organizing. So we just shifted so that it encompassed a lot more of the issues that we were dealing with now. We were engaged. I mean, those first 2 weeks, I said I was busier than ever before because it's so immediate, when you're talking to lawmakers and saying, look, we need this now, we need this why, and going back and forth. And then what was great to see was that in such what seemed like pretty quickly, a lot of these industry leaders and professionals came together and created a coalition of independent restaurateurs to really stand up for all the small businesses. Because for a long time you heard from the chains and, the lobbyists on Capitol Hill who really had more of the big chains interests at heart and not necessarily the small independent restaurants that, have maybe 50 employees. And so it was great to see that, they came together and formed this coalition and have made a big difference in making sure that small business in the food industry is being considered. For what it's going to need to get past this.
So what's your stance on all of this, on the small business loans that have gone out, on why we're still in quarantine, how difficult it is for people to actually go to restaurants, especially in the states where you are, New York, Boston, the East Coast, where the cities are heavily impacted. What's your stance on all of this and how do we respond after?
Well, the first and most important position on all this that I think any responsible business owner or government leader is to keep social distancing and do what's right to flatten this curve so we can get out of this, mess and hopefully prevent another spread from coming. So most, in New York here, where I am in New York City, a lot of restaurants are closed and have been for, over a month now. The few that are open as takeout or delivery, they're able to open. Some aren't able to open that way and function that way, and some are, and they're taking a lot of safety precautions, and they're choosing to do it to be there for their community because people still need to eat. So, and that's fine. But I think, the CARE Act that was passed was necessary. It definitely helped, but it didn't help nearly as much as it could have or should have, in the sense that, we see these major chains like Ruth Chris Steakhouse and Shake Shack and, all these different mega chains that got the money. Thankfully, Shake Shack, under the leadership of Danny Meyer, returned the $10 million. And everyone was, I guess, applying for it, not knowing necessarily how exactly the rules were. So why not apply? But, I don't know, when you know that you've got some small mom and pop shops that desperately need any help right now to just stay alive, and then it's going to, like, these mega chains. That's not right. And the fact that a lot of this, they also don't know some of the so I guess some of the nuances of, like, for instance, restaurants that have been closed down now, they're not going to be able to open anytime soon and have in dining seating. That's just not going to be able to be done. But to get the loans forgiven, they have to hire back 100% of their staff. And people are like, well, how does that make sense? Because if we finally open, it's not going to be once we get the funds. It's going to be maybe thereafter, and so how am I going to hire all my staff back when I'm still not even fully open? So it's a lot of those types of things that I think the government needs to realize. Restaurants, cafes, bakeries, they literally revitalize a city, a town, a neighborhood. You go to some of these areas, like we were in Detroit, and because we did a nationwide screening tour, where what we do is go into these communities and pay tribute to a lot of the chefs, restaurateurs, woman-led businesses who don't get necessarily the PR or the awards that they deserve. So we say, you know what, you're a pillar in your community, you've been doing this for so long, people here know you, we want to celebrate you. And we went to Detroit, phenomenal woman-led businesses there in the food industry in Detroit, and they have literally revitalized so many neighborhoods in Detroit. And that's the power of a restaurant, of a small business like a bakery, a cafe, because it brings people to that, to that establishment and creates community. And all of a sudden, real estate values go up. All of a sudden, you don't have empty storefronts, and more people want to go and create businesses around that pillar location. So it really makes a big difference to have those types of establishments. And to think, if the government doesn't realize that, or if they do, which they all make these, grand statements on news, well, then get these loans forgiven. And not have it be based on, these absurd, ways of how the loan is forgiven. Just make it flat across. Like right now, they're back at it. The Independent Restaurant Coalition is back at it, trying to say to our leaders and our lawmakers and legislators, please, we need at least 6 months to get ourselves back, back on our feet. And that's like obvious, so I just wish it would be less political and more like common sense when it comes to getting some of this aid, tax deferrals, things like that, that really make a huge difference for small business restaurants in particular.
Interesting. So I have a few takes on this thing. And the first one is, I don't want to undermine social distancing at all. Very important. We need to stay. That's the only thing right now, what we can tell has been flattening that curve.
Right.
I also don't want to undermine the power and the acumen of small business owners. They too, they don't want COVID-19. They don't want to get diseases, and they need to stay in business. I'm a firm believer that, small business owners are willing to take action to create social distancing within their restaurants, whether it's takeout orders, whether it's 6 feet apart, whether it's order online, small steps that they can do and adapt to an environment like this, especially if we, let down the guard of social distancing and then the spike comes back. So that's one take I had on this thing. And it's very different in New York versus in California, where we're much more spread out. There's less people probably going into one store than another. But it's still something that, we can social distance, but we're going to stay in the same place until a vaccine comes. I mean, that's right. That's the only thing. So, and another take on this I was interested in is how business will change after this. What we're seeing is, why would a small business shut down? Well, all the indirect costs that are associated with not making a product cost business owners a lot of money, and those become sunk costs. They have to then lay off the variable costs, which are if you're paying an employee a wage, you have to lay those people off. That's all you can really get rid of at this moment in time to save money. And so that kind of adds up over time. And these small business loans are essentially, patches to get those things back and restore the order and balance out those fixed costs to break even. How do you think businesses are going to change after something like this, especially if we're prone to another pandemic?
Yeah, well, I think already there's been some very creative ideas and how to approach business right now. And this goes towards what we're doing, what we're going to start doing. But a lot of what's so inspiring is seeing a lot of these business owners who are feeding the healthcare workers or first responders or the needy. And basically what happens is a lot of customers who love these small businesses, who have been loyal customers for a long time, they want to help, and that's what's amazing is, when you go into these communities and you see, they don't wait for government, but this is one of those times we actually need government. So it's very important we get their help, but you see what's happening on the ground. And so, a lot of people or organizations are donating money to these small businesses, to these restaurants, and then the money goes towards feeding healthcare workers, which is great. My mother's doing that actually. She's been doing that for the past month, every week doing this, and then food gets delivered to the local hospitals there. Maria Loy in New York City is doing that. We're going to be filming her soon. Tanya Holland in Oakland, California, and so many, countless names. There's a lot that are doing this, which is great. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is really just being responsible. As a owner, you have, like you said, you have to do things in a way that's measured. So you're not endangering your staff, your customers, of course. But these people know what they're doing, and that's why many of them have closed down, and many of them are open now, but doing this curbside or takeout. And then thinking about the future, it's really something you have to consider, because, like, I know, for instance, my mother, she has a function room. Now, is she ever going to have functions again of 200 people? I don't know. I can't even fathom that right now. People are still going to be scared to go out in a crowded room, let alone, for a gathering. I don't think we're going to have gatherings for a long time. So business owners need to factor all that in and adapt. And I think that's the definition of a leader, right? Is always being able to adapt to your current situation and doing it in a way that, you're bringing your people with you. You're doing not what's popular, necessarily what's popular, but what's right. And I think these leaders are going to have to really be very thoughtful, what's right for their, customers, for their staff, but also how in the world are they going to stay in business or get to do what they love. There's almost like I could see sort of we create a new deal in the way we feed people, feed our workers, feed, now's the time to be doing a lot of construction, empty streets, empty roadways, bridges. Let's get past all the political gridlock and get people to work. Do a lot more that has to do with energy and sustainability. And maybe we tap into the restaurateurs and the caterers and the cafes and bakeries to feed these people. We have to be creative, because when FDR came at the Great Depression, everything he initially suggested was obviously very revolutionary, but it's what got us out of the Great Depression. So I think we need true leadership now to really start to connect the dots and bring a lot of different fields together to come up with solutions that help everyone in all these different industries or different areas.
Joanna, when I asked you about what a good story was, you said, characters who transform, and people can see that transformation in themselves. And you took Homer's approach of starting at the middle and or taking the part from the middle and the actions and putting it at the very beginning and then leading up to it. Right now, we're in the middle of this. How do you want this story to end?
It would really be great to see leadership on both sides of the aisle, because I think everyone is craving that and thirsting for that. For so long, there's been obstructionism. There's been gridlock. There's been, no, we're not going to do the right thing because we want our party to get it, or we want the credit. And I forget which woman said this. I really need to figure it out. But there was a woman who said the way she got into leadership, and what more women need to do is just, or not just women, it was men too. Don't care about taking credit for something, or else you're never going to get anywhere. Just get it done. And in one way, as a woman, it's about, we always say we need to take ownership and not be afraid to go for it and take credit. But on the other hand, when it comes to getting big things done, it really is about just what's best for, the people, for the country, for our businesses. And in this situation, it needs to be people coming together to work together. And I just hope we can see that, because so far, yes, some legislation was passed, but again, those are Band-Aids. We need a lot more to happen, and pretty quickly. So, we have to stay tuned and see how that will go. But I do think it would be amazing to see a new deal all over again, and using our workers, making like a call to action, a call to service. So people people aren't doing the things we've heard of recently, where some of these Ivy League schools or businesses are taking money that they know they shouldn't be taking. Let's have a call to service, so people want to serve and want to help and make sacrifices for our country, like we did, to get out of the Depression or the 50s, some of these eras that really we depended on each other to pull ourselves up.
Joanna, thinking big. I like it. The constant theme throughout this, and I'd say not just the quarantine right now, like everyone's vulnerable. Everyone's real with each other. You go on Zoom calls, everyone's in their homes. It's just like everyone gets, being on the same page right now. Your mother, you said she was very raw, very real, lowers the armor. And some business leaders feel like they have to have armor over them. You mentioned leadership and what will be needed, a call to service. So Joanna, the last question I have for you today is simple. What is your definition of a real leader?
Well, I think we talked a little bit about it, but I do think a real leader, you have to always be ready to adjust and to mindfully look at your scenario or whatever new landscape is approaching, and how you can take the appropriate action to to take your organization or your people to that next level, and to do it in a way that's right for everyone, and the hardest part to doing that is usually communicating it. And that goes back to, why I'm in storytelling, is communication, but getting people to trust, to believe in you, respect you, and that's why they want to come on board and join you. So I think that's it. I would also just like to say, because we are doing this, we're about to sort of take on our own leadership again with MAP, where we're starting a campaign called Small Biz Feeds Our Heroes. So we've already raised some money to go directly to these restaurants. We're providing grants to women-led restaurants in the hardest hit states by COVID-19. And I'm personally going to go there and film on my iPhone. So be very caution and safe, and really make a call to action to the public to support these businesses. A lot of what we hear is happening, but really put a lens on it, because I think it's a lot easier for people to see why they need to support and help when they hear directly from the subjects who are on the front lines, either serving our healthcare workers, our first responders. So if you visit mapimpact.com, you can learn more about it. We're going to start filming soon. So that's what we're doing.
Well, there you have it, folks. We've been telling our audience all along that now is the time to take action. You're outside, you're at home, you want to help. There's an example right there, folks. Well, Joanna James, just want to thank you for coming on the show today. I signed the pledge this morning, actually, and we'll embed it. We'll embed it on our website as well. I got that code, so we'll make sure we get that done. Just want to appreciate you coming on the show, Joanna. I've learned a lot today, and really how to articulate that vision. I think you did a great job, and I hope our audience enjoys it as much as I did. So for Janet and James, I'm Kevin Edwards, asking you to go out there, take appropriate action, people, and always keep it real. Thanks, Joanna. Appreciate you.